Imagine living for years without knowing what happened to your missing child, carrying the emptiness and pain of that loss. This is the story of a millionaire who, while walking past his gardener, notices a small detail that makes him stop in his tracks. A pendant, and he discovers something surprising. Could it be that, after so many years, fate has finally brought him the answers he has long sought? Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you don't miss the next chapters of this and other stories. Augusto Valente grew up in a small neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, and dreams were often considered a luxury. From a young age, he knew he didn't want to follow the same path as his parents, who struggled all their lives to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. Every time he heard his father say, "Life is tough, but it's what we have," Augusto felt a fire ignite within him. He refused to accept that reality. He wanted more, much more, and he knew he had the potential to achieve it. At 18, Augusto decided he would do whatever it took to escape that life. He studied during the day and worked at night in a small market. There was no room for rest or fun. Every penny he earned, he saved, not for any indulgence, but to fuel his dream of creating his own business. He carefully observed the wealthy people who passed by the market, dressed in expensive clothes and driving cars whose names he couldn't even pronounce. He didn't feel envy, but inspiration. One day, he thought, "I'll be like them." However, the road was not easy. Augusto faced countless difficulties, failures, and closed doors. But with every fall, he got up more determined. Little by little, he began to build his career in the business world. First, with small investments, and later by expanding his knowledge and network of contacts. He knew the key to success was surrounding himself with people who believed in his vision. By the time he was 30, Augusto had already achieved more than anyone in his family had ever dreamed of. He owned a small but thriving import-export business, and his ambitions didn't stop there. He was determined to turn that company into an empire. His dedication was relentless, and success began to come at an impressive speed. New contracts, new partnerships, and soon his company became one of the most respected in the sector. As the years went by, Augusto Valente's success seemed limitless. His company, which had started as a small venture, now dominated international markets. New opportunities arose at every moment, and he felt the pressure to always be ahead, expanding his empire, ensuring that no one would surpass him. The ambition that had driven him to the top now began to exact a toll he wasn't prepared to pay. Augusto often said that he was doing it all for his family, especially for his son, Pedro. He believed that the more wealth and financial stability he secured, the safer Pedro's future would be. However, that relentless pursuit of growth was driving him away from the ones he loved most. Endless meetings, business trips that kept him away from home for weeks, and the constant need to be present in the office took up all his time and energy. And even when he was home, his physical presence didn't mean attention. The dining table, once filled with lively conversations and laughter between father and son, now seemed emptier. Pedro, 12 years old, increasingly felt his father's absence. He would look at the chair where Augusto should be, but it was almost always empty. When Augusto did appear, his responses were brief, his eyes glued to his phone, or he spent dinner discussing some business strategy on calls. Conversations with Pedro became brief and superficial. The admiration Pedro felt for his father still existed, but now it was mixed with a sense of loss. He adored Augusto, but that man always seemed far away, even when he was right beside him. There were moments when Pedro tried to get his father's attention, showing him his school grades or telling him about his adventures with friends at school. But his father, immersed in financial reports or concerned with international contracts, would just nod without really listening. With each failed attempt, Pedro withdrew more, getting used to the idea that his father, the great Augusto Valente, was always too busy for him. One night, Pedro, already 12, was in the mansion's garden, playing with the pendant his father had given him. It was a cold night, and he remembered how, when he was younger, he used to run around the garden with Augusto, laughing and making up stories of pirates and treasure hunters. Now, however, he was alone. Pedro looked at the pendant and wondered if his father would ever return to being the present man, the hero he had admired so much. On the other hand, Augusto believed he was doing what was necessary. He saw his absence as temporary, something that would soon be corrected. "It's just for a while," he repeated to himself. "Once I solve these new business deals, I'll spend more time with Pedro." But time never seemed enough. There was always one more contract, one more meeting, one more urgent project that required his immediate attention. The truth, however, was that he was already missing the most important moments of Pedro's life. He didn't notice the small changes in his son, the doubts that arose, the conversations that weren't happening. And worst of all, he didn't realize that the bond that had once united them was slowly eroding. Pedro kept waiting for his father, wishing for the day when Augusto would finally put business aside and return to being the present father, the man he had so admired. But that day seemed never to come. It was a cold and silent night. The mansion of Augusto Valente, usually filled with lights and the sounds of parties, was unusually calm. Pedro, the son he loved so much, was in his room, wearing the pendant Augusto had given him on his 10th birthday. The pendant was simple, but held enormous sentimental value for both of them. It represented Augusto's promise that, despite his long working hours, Pedro would always be his priority. That night, once again, Augusto was caught in a never-ending phone meeting, discussing the details of a new business deal. His mind was consumed by numbers, contracts, and profits. Meanwhile, on the other side of the house, Pedro, bored with his father's constant absence, decided he needed a break from the emptiness he felt. He put on his coat, hung the pendant over his shirt, and walked out through the garden door. He loved walking at night, getting lost in his thoughts, trying in some way to connect with the father who seemed to be drifting further away every day. No one in the house noticed when Pedro left. The maids were busy. Augusto was locked in his office, and his wife, Helena, was upstairs, getting ready for bed. Minutes turned into hours, and Pedro didn't return. The clock passed 10, then 11. At first, no one worried. Pedro was a responsible child and often spent more time than expected playing in the garden or at a neighbor's house. But as the night wore on, Helena felt something strange in the air. She went downstairs looking for her son. First, she called his name softly, then with more urgency. The echo of her voice resonating through the mansion's hallway increased her concern. "Pedro?" The silence that followed was deafening. She ran up to Augusto's office, knocking urgently on the door. He, still with the phone in his hand, at first thought it was a common issue, something from the day-to-day. "I'll go see where he is," he said distractedly, hanging up the phone. But when he went to Pedro's room and saw that the boy wasn't there, something deep in his chest tightened. An inexplicable feeling took over his body. "Pedro?" Augusto's voice now reflected the panic that Helena had already been feeling. The search began immediately. Augusto called his son's friends, checked every corner of the property, shouted Pedro's name in the garden, but there was no response. The clock now struck midnight, and despair began to fill the house. Helicopters were activated, the police arrived, and what had been a simple initial alarm turned into a desperate search across the entire region. That night was one of the longest in Augusto and Helena's lives. While the police began their search, Augusto remained motionless, staring at the front door, as if expecting Pedro to appear at any moment, smiling and apologizing for being late. But Pedro never appeared. The days that followed were a fog of desperation and sadness. The investigations were intense. Helicopters, search teams, and police scoured every corner of the city, but no trace of Pedro was found. The last clue was disturbing. A neighbor had said they saw him walking alone that night, wearing the pendant Augusto had given him. From there, the trail simply disappeared. Augusto and Helena were devastated. With each passing day without news, Augusto's heart filled with a pain he had never felt before. Guilt consumed him. He blamed himself for not being there, for letting work consume his time with his son. In his mind, he replayed every moment when he could have paid more attention to Pedro, wondering if, somehow, that could have made a difference on that fateful night. The relationship between Augusto and Helena, already weakened by his constant absence, began to fall apart. Helena, in her grief and pain, began to openly blame Augusto. She believed that if he had been a more present father, perhaps Pedro wouldn't have left the house that night. The arguments between them became frequent and bitter, and the love they once shared was lost amid the pain of loss and mutual accusations. The empire Augusto had built over decades now seemed insignificant in the face of the tragedy. His missing son was the only thing that mattered, but at the same time, it was what he couldn't bring back. With each day without answers, Augusto sank deeper into a sea of guilt and despair. He hired the best investigators, offered rewards, sought help from every corner of the world. But nothing, absolutely nothing, seemed to bring Pedro back. Years passed, but the weight of Pedro's loss never left Augusto Valente's heart. He was a man who, in the eyes of the world, had it all: luxurious mansions, extravagant cars, and a company that continued to thrive, even without his active involvement. But what people didn't see was the growing emptiness inside him, an emptiness that no amount of money, success, or ostentation could fill. Augusto tried everything to forget the pain. He invested in grand parties, events that filled his mansions with people, music, and laughter. But those laughs never resonated in his heart. He surrounded himself with people who only wanted to enjoy his fortune, but no one there filled the void Pedro had left. While the world around him seemed to be in constant celebration, Augusto sank deeper and deeper into unbearable loneliness. He started investing even more in material possessions. He bought jewelry, rare works of art, cars whose names he couldn't even remember. He remodeled his properties, built new mansions in paradise-like locations, and acquired companies as if more success and more conquests could erase the suffering. But with each new contract signed, with each party that ended at dawn, the silence of his inner pain grew louder. No matter how hard he tried to distract himself, every night, when he returned to one of his many empty houses, Pedro's absence was a constant shadow. He found himself looking at the pendant he had given his son, imagining where the boy could be. He wondered if Pedro still wore that small symbol of the connection they had before everything fell apart. He sought some kind of redemption, a way to forgive himself for not being present as he should have been, but he never found peace. One day, after a particularly lonely night, something inside Augusto changed. He realized he was tired of pretending the outside world could heal the inner pain. The parties, the investments, the cars, and the mansions were just ways to try to escape a truth he couldn't face. Nothing would bring his son back. There was no success or luxury enough to fill the hole Pedro had left in his life. So, Augusto made a radical decision. He disconnected from the world he was used to. He decided to sell some of his properties, got rid of many of his possessions, and, to the surprise of his high society colleagues, disappeared from public life. Augusto no longer cared about curious glances or whispers about his absence from important events. He needed peace, a place where he could be far from everything and everyone, where no one knew him as the successful millionaire, but simply as a man seeking redemption. He found an isolated property in the countryside, far from the hustle of the city and the prying eyes of the media. It was a simple house, surrounded by vast fields and tall trees that swayed gently in the wind. The place was a stark contrast to everything he had lived up until then. There were no grand parties or expensive cars, just the sound of nature and a tranquility he hadn't known in a long time. At the new property, silence and tranquility became part of Augusto Valente's daily routine. He had completely distanced himself from the hectic life he once knew. Surrounded by nature, time seemed to flow differently. It was almost as if the wind that blew across the fields carried with it a kind of peace Augusto had long sought. Visits were rare, and he preferred it that way. One day, realizing the vast garden around the property needed care, Augusto hired a local gardener. The man, with a simple appearance, was known in the small nearby town for being an honest and dedicated worker, but also for his discretion. His name was Gabriel, and from the moment he arrived, it was clear he was a man of few words. He didn't ask much, and he didn't try to engage in conversation with Augusto either. He simply did his job meticulously and quietly, almost as if he were part of the landscape. Gabriel was a middle-aged man with calloused hands and a face marked by the sun. His gaze was serene, and his movements in the garden were precise, as if he knew each plant, each leaf. He didn't carry the weight of Augusto's life, and perhaps that's why the millionaire barely interacted with him. Gabriel was a presence that almost went unnoticed on the vast property. Augusto, immersed in his own thoughts and in the peace he sought, barely noticed him. The days passed monotonously. Gabriel would arrive every morning, starting his work before sunrise and leaving at the end of the afternoon, leaving the garden immaculate. Augusto, for his part, continued his solitary walks through the fields, seeking silent solace in nature. However, something was about to change. One morning, the sky was particularly clear, and a gentle breeze swayed the leaves of the trees. Augusto, as usual, decided to take a walk in the garden. He followed a stone path that wound between the flowers and trees, carefully pruned by Gabriel. It was an ordinary day, just another in the quiet routine he had built for himself. However, something happened that broke that normality. As Augusto walked through the garden that sunny morning, lost in his thoughts, something unexpected caught his attention. His steps, which had previously followed a steady, calm rhythm, suddenly slowed. His eyes, always so used to ignoring the details of the simple routine around him, were drawn to the gardener in front of him. Gabriel, as usual, was focused on his work, crouched among the flowers, his calloused hands skillfully moving between the plants. But it wasn't the gardener himself that had made Augusto stop. It was something shining around his neck, hanging from a chain. At first glance, it seemed like a simple pendant, something anyone could wear. But as Augusto drew closer, his eyes locked onto that small object, and a deep sense of recognition washed over him. His heart, which had long beaten sluggishly under the weight of grief and pain, began to race involuntarily. He stopped abruptly, his body frozen in place, unable to take another step. It wasn't just any pendant. It was the same pendant his son, Pedro, had worn the day he disappeared. The very object Augusto had given to his son as a birthday gift when the boy turned 10, symbolizing their bond and the promise to always be connected. That pendant carried with it both painful and joyful memories. The delicate shape, the subtle gleam, and the image of seeing it around Pedro's neck as he ran carefree through the garden were impossible to forget. Augusto stood paralyzed for a few seconds, unable to process what he was seeing. How could this be? The last time he had seen that pendant, it was around his son's neck, the morning Pedro disappeared. Since that fateful day, the pendant had become a key piece in his painful memories, a symbol of Pedro's absence. How could that object, loaded with so much history and personal meaning, now be hanging around the neck of a man he barely knew? Time seemed to slow as Augusto struggled to find a logical explanation. Could it be a coincidence? Number. He knew that pendant, every detail etched into the metal, every curve of the chain. There wasn't another like it. A whirlwind of questions flooded his mind. How had Gabriel obtained the pendant? What was its story? And most importantly, what did this mean about the fate of his son? Augusto Valente's heart pounded in his chest. That pendant, the same one he had given to his son Pedro, the same one that disappeared along with the boy, was now before his eyes, hanging around the neck of a man he barely knew. He could no longer contain the storm of emotions overtaking him: shock, confusion, fear, and above all, desperation. He felt the weight of years of guilt and mourning collapse on him with an almost unbearable intensity. Something inside him broke, and before he could control it, he was already approaching Gabriel, his voice coming out with a tone of urgency he didn't recognize in himself. "Where did you get that pendant?" Augusto asked, his voice trembling between desperation and disbelief. He had never spoken to Gabriel in this way before, but now all he could think about was getting an immediate answer. "Answer me. Where did you get it?" Gabriel, the usually reserved and quiet gardener, was visibly startled by his employer's emotional outburst. He straightened slowly, pruning shears still in hand, and looked at Augusto with a mix of confusion and caution. The sudden glint in the millionaire's eyes, the intensity with which he spoke, was something Gabriel was unaccustomed to. "What's wrong, sir?" Gabriel asked, his voice low and controlled, almost fearing the answer. He held the pendant between his fingers, gazing at it as if truly noticing it for the first time. It was an object he had carried with him for so long, something that had always been with him, but had never meant anything more than a piece of his distant childhood. Augusto stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the pendant. "That pendant, it belonged to my son," he said, his voice almost breaking from the pain he had kept locked inside for years. "My son Pedro wore it the day he disappeared. How did you get it?" Gabriel's expression shifted. His face, once calm, now showed faint concern, as though he were being accused of something terrible without understanding why. He looked back at the pendant as if trying to remember something long forgotten. "Sir, I've always had this pendant," he said hesitantly. "For as long as I can remember, It's been with me. I don't know where it came from, but it's the only thing I have from my past." Augusto felt as though the ground had vanished beneath his feet. "The only thing from your past?" he repeated, stunned. His heart raced as his mind tried to piece together this improbable story. Gabriel sighed, sensing the need to explain more. "I was raised by a couple who found me abandoned when I was very young," he began, his eyes fixed on the pendant. "They found me in a small village, near a deserted road. I had nothing with me, except this pendant around my neck. They adopted me and took care of me, but they never knew where I came from, who my parents were, or how I ended up there." The shock coursing through Augusto seemed to intensify with every new word Gabriel spoke. The millionaire stood still for a moment, looking at the gardener in a new light. Gabriel appeared to be around 20 years old, the same age Pedro would have been if he were still alive. That coincidence, which had once seemed impossible, was now becoming a real, terrifying, and at the same time, hopeful possibility. As he looked at Gabriel, a flood of memories overwhelmed him. Pedro's laughter, his innocent way of running through the house, the glint of the pendant around his neck, all of it came rushing back to Augusto with painful clarity. And there, at that moment, as he observed Gabriel, he began to see fragments of his missing son's face. There was something in the young gardener's eyes, something familiar that made his heart race even more, with a mixture of hope and fear. In an effort to stay calm, Augusto tried to organize his thoughts. He needed to know more. He needed to ask questions, and above all, he needed answers. Every detail about Gabriel's story could be the key to unraveling the mystery that had tormented him for years. "You said your adoptive parents found you near a city, right?" Augusto asked, trying not to let his whirlwind of emotions show. His voice, though trembling, was filled with urgency. He needed to understand if Gabriel's story truly connected to Pedro's disappearance. Gabriel nodded, seemingly confused by the intensity of the questions, but answered calmly, "Yes, sir. They found me near a small city, on a deserted road. It was late at night, and they said I was alone, with no one around." Augusto's heart beat even faster. He remembered perfectly how the searches for Pedro had been focused on similar areas, roads leading out of the city, places where the clues had vanished. Every detail seemed to align with what he knew, with what he had already lived through. "Do you remember anything?" Augusto asked, hoping for any memory that might confirm his suspicions. "Anything from before they found you?" Gabriel frowned, clearly struggling to access vague and distant memories. "Not much, sir. I was very small. I remember being cold and feeling scared. But my adoptive parents said I didn't talk much about what happened before they found me. They thought maybe I had blocked out those memories." The air around them seemed to thicken as Augusto pieced it all together. Gabriel's age, the city, the pendant. Everything was beginning to fit into a puzzle he had never imagined could be solved. Yet with every answer Gabriel gave, the coincidences became more than mere chance. "How old were you when they found you?" Augusto asked, his voice now more controlled, but filled with anticipation. Gabriel hesitated for a second, trying to remember what his adoptive parents had always told him. They thought I was about 11 or 12 years old, something like that. 11 or 12 years old, the same age Pedro was when he disappeared. A chill ran down Augusto's spine. He looked at Gabriel once again, trying to see in him the features of the child he had lost. The boyish traits were no longer there, but something about Gabriel's demeanor, the serenity he radiated, reminded him of Pedro. Everything was there. The scattered pieces of the puzzle, The pendant, the age, the time, the place where Gabriel had been found. Each detail, no matter how small, seemed to connect to Pedro in an eerily precise way. But what did this mean? Could it be possible that, after all these years of mourning and searching, Pedro was standing there in front of him, living as a gardener, with no idea of his true identity? Augusto felt the weight of hope growing inside him, along with the fear of deceiving himself. He knew that if he was right, the life he knew would change forever. But if he was wrong, the abyss of pain could be even deeper than before. The silence between them stretched for what seemed like an eternity. Gabriel, now more aware of Augusto's strange behavior, asked, "Why are you asking me all of this? What does this pendant have to do with your son?" Augusto took a deep breath, feeling as though he was about to step into an emotional territory that could break him completely. Because this pendant, it belonged to Pedro, my son. He disappeared many years ago, with this very pendant around his neck. And now you're telling me that you were found alone with this pendant. This isn't a coincidence, Gabriel. I need to know who you really are. The gardener looked at Augusto, his clear eyes reflecting the same confusion and curiosity that mirrored the millionaire's heart. Despite all the coincidences, Augusto Valente doubted. The idea that Gabriel, the simple and reserved gardener he barely knew, could be Pedro, his lost son, was both a hope and a deep fear. Augusto knew that if he let this idea dominate his mind and was wrong, the pain would be even greater than the one he already carried. So, although every part of his soul wanted to believe, he decided to proceed cautiously. Watching Gabriel finish his work that day, Augusto felt the weight of doubt pressing on his chest. He knew he couldn't confront the gardener directly with his suspicions. It was too risky. What if he was wrong? What if Gabriel was just an ordinary young man who, for some unknown reason, had ended up with Pedro's pendant? What would he do then? Augusto needed concrete answers, something to confirm his suspicions beyond mere coincidences. Determined to investigate, he chose not to say anything to Gabriel. He didn't want to raise suspicions or create expectations, neither in the young man nor in himself. The path he would now follow would be in silence, carefully. That night, as Gabriel returned home, Augusto began to map out his plan. He had been through this before, in the desperate searches he undertook right after Pedro's disappearance. He had hired the best detectives, conducted exhaustive investigations, yet it had all been in vain. But now, the pieces were moving in a different way. There was a possibility, no matter how small, that the answer to the mystery was right there, within his grasp. Augusto Valente, still immersed in his doubts and hesitation, couldn't shake the feeling that the coincidences were too strong to ignore. The pendant, Gabriel's age, the place where he was found, everything indicated that there was more to this story than Gabriel knew. Determined to find the truth, Augusto hired a private investigator, someone he trusted who had helped him through other difficult times in his life. The investigator, a middle-aged man, discreet and efficient, began his work immediately. His mission was clear: uncover everything about Gabriel's childhood. What were the details of the young gardener's past? Where had he grown up? Who had raised him? And, most importantly, where and how had he been found? Days turned into weeks, and Augusto waited anxiously for any news. Every night was a mix of hope and fear. He mentally reviewed all the information he had gathered so far, searching for clues he might have overlooked. The doubt, which had once been an unbearable weight, now mingled with the expectation that the truth might finally be within his reach. Time passed, and finally, on a sunny afternoon, the first news from the investigator arrived. They met at the mansion, far from the curious eyes of the staff. The investigator, with a folder of documents and notes in hand, entered with the same seriousness as always, but something in his expression suggested that he had discovered something important. "Mr. Valente, we found something that I think will be of interest to you," he said, opening the folder and organizing the information. Gabriel was found by a couple on a cold night, more than 15 years ago. They found him abandoned on a road near a small town. What's curious is that this town is on the outskirts of the city where your son disappeared. The investigator's words hung in the air like a crushing revelation. Augusto's heart began to beat faster, and he leaned forward, feeling the tension rise. "Are you telling me that Gabriel was found near the same town where Pedro disappeared?" The investigator nodded slowly. "Yes. The couple who found him knew nothing about his origin. They took him in and raised him as their own son, but they never knew where he came from or who his biological parents were. The only thing he had with him was the pendant, the same one you mentioned." Augusto felt a wave of emotions flooding his mind, fear and hope intertwined in a suffocating way. This was the confirmation he had both dreaded and longed for. How could it be a coincidence? Gabriel, a boy found in the same region where Pedro disappeared, with the same pendant around his neck. It was too much to ignore. "Is the couple still alive?" Augusto asked, his urgency barely contained. He needed more answers. He needed to speak to these people, to understand what they knew, or perhaps what they didn't know. The investigator paused before responding. Unfortunately, the couple passed away a few years ago. The young man was raised by them until adolescence, and then he went on his own. He moved to different towns, worked on farms and rural properties, until he settled here as a gardener. Augusto remained silent, processing each detail. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but absolute certainty was still missing. He knew he couldn't rely solely on assumptions. Pedro's disappearance had been the tragedy of his life, and he couldn't bear another disappointment. But at the same time, how could he deny the facts? Gabriel had been found at the exact place and time. The pendant, the only object connecting him to his son, was there, a silent reminder of everything he had lost. Sensing Augusto's emotional turmoil, the investigator continued. "We can still search for more information. There are medical records from the local hospital where Gabriel was taken when he was found. We could also do a DNA test, if you wish. This would confirm any connection between you." The suggestion of a DNA test made Augusto breathe deeply. That could bring the definitive answer, but it could also destroy any hope he had. For a moment, he remained silent, feeling the weight of the decision before him. "Yes," he said finally, his voice firm. "Do the DNA test. I want the truth, no matter the cost." The investigator nodded and began organizing the process. Augusto knew that, in the coming days, the truth would be laid bare before him, whatever it might be. And until then, he would live in a limbo of hope and fear, waiting for the answer that could change his life forever. Gripped by the mix of hope and fear, Augusto knew he could no longer avoid the truth. The coincidences were too strong to ignore, and each passing day seemed to increase the anxiety in his heart. He needed to know. He needed to be sure if Gabriel, the simple living gardener, was really Pedro, his son, who had disappeared so many years ago. With a lump in his throat and a racing heart, Augusto decided he could no longer delay that conversation. That morning, he found Gabriel working in the garden, as always. The young man was focused, pruning some plants with his usual calm. Silently, Augusto approached, his mind racing with what he was about to say. "Gabriel, can I talk to you for a moment?" asked Augusto, trying to keep his voice steady, though his anxiety was evident. Gabriel looked up, surprised by the approach. He rarely had long conversations with his boss, so the seriousness in Augusto's tone made him stop immediately. He wiped his hands on his apron and approached with a curious expression. "Of course, Mr. Valente. Did something happen?" Gabriel asked, always respectful, but now visibly intrigued. Augusto took a deep breath before continuing. "I want to do something that might seem strange to you, but it could clarify a lot about your past. You told me that you don't know your true origins, right? That you were found by a couple." Gabriel nodded. "Yes, sir. I never knew where I came from. It's always been a mystery to me." "Well," Augusto continued, his voice now more tense, "I would like to suggest that we do a DNA test. I don't want to scare you, but there are some coincidences that have made me think that perhaps you're more connected to my life than you realize." Gabriel was surprised, but did not back down. On the contrary, his eyes shone with genuine curiosity. He had always wanted to know more about his past, and Augusto's offer seemed like an opportunity to finally discover the answers he had been seeking all his life. "I see no problem, sir. If it can clarify something, I'm willing to take the test," Gabriel replied without hesitation. The relief mixed with fear ran through Augusto's body. He hadn't expected such acceptance, but it gave him the courage he needed to move forward. The preparations were swift, and soon the necessary material was collected. Now, the only thing left was to wait. In the following days, while the DNA test results were being processed, Augusto began to look at Gabriel in a different way. He couldn't reveal the true reason for his closeness, but gradually, a change settled in his behavior. He started to approach Gabriel more paternally, observing him more closely, searching for traces of Pedro in the young man. Every gesture, every expression of Gabriel reminded him of his lost son. Augusto invited Gabriel to have lunch with him on the terrace, something he had never done before. They talked about simple things, the work in the garden, life in the small town. But behind every word, there was an emotional depth that Augusto tried to conceal. It was as if, unconsciously, he was building a relationship with Gabriel, emotionally preparing himself for the possible revelation. In one of those conversations, Gabriel spoke of his love for plants and how he felt at peace working with them. Augusto listened, but in his mind, he tried to associate this with the Pedro he once knew. Did Pedro like nature? Was he as calm as Gabriel? He searched in every detail for confirmation, no matter how subtle. On another occasion, Augusto suggested that Gabriel accompany him for a walk around the property. As they strolled through the vast fields, Augusto discreetly asked questions about Gabriel's childhood, trying to gather more information. "Do you remember anything before you were found?" he asked casually, trying not to seem desperate. Gabriel, always serene, shook his head. "No, sir. Just some vague memories, like fragments of a dream I can't piece together." Every response from Gabriel seemed to align with what Augusto both feared and hoped for. The idea that the gardener might really be Pedro became increasingly real, and at the same time, more terrifying. Augusto felt torn. If the results confirmed his suspicions, he would finally have his son back. But what if he was wrong? How would he handle the disappointment? As the days dragged on, Augusto's anxiety grew. He didn't want to rush Gabriel, but the wait was unbearable. He found himself observing the young man with increasing affection, almost like a father looking at his son without the other knowing. There was something familiar in the way Gabriel moved, in his calm posture, in his simple way of dealing with the world around him. Augusto found himself thinking about what it would be like if, finally, he could embrace Pedro again. But no matter how much Augusto tried to get closer to Gabriel, he kept his secret well hidden. He never mentioned the true reason for his changed behavior. All Gabriel knew was that somehow he now seemed to be part of something bigger, something that connected him to the mysterious past he had always tried to unravel. And then, finally, the day arrived. The results were ready. The envelope containing the answers that could change their lives was in Augusto's hands. As he looked at the sealed paper, his heart raced. This was the moment of truth, the moment he had long awaited, and at the same time, feared. The envelope sat on the table in front of Augusto, small and silent, but heavy with years of suffering, hope, and uncertainty. He stared at it for a few minutes, just looking at the sealed paper, unable to move. All of Augusto's life seemed condensed into that instant, into that simple object that contained the definitive answer to what the future held. With trembling hands, he finally opened the envelope. The paper slid out slowly, revealing the words he both feared and longed for. As his eyes scanned the result, the air around him seemed to disappear. For a brief moment, he heard nothing but the quickened beat of his heart. It was true. Gabriel was Pedro. His missing son, the boy he had spent years searching for, was right there in front of his eyes, living a completely different life, unaware of who he really was. The tears came before Augusto could control them. All the weight, the pain, and the guilt accumulated over the years hit him at once, and he felt as if the world around him was both falling apart and rebuilding itself at the same time. Without wasting time, Augusto knew he had to tell Gabriel the truth. This couldn't wait any longer. He went to the garden where the young man was working, as always, tending to the plants. When Gabriel saw him approach, he noticed something different in the millionaire's expression. Augusto was more emotional than ever. His face revealed a mixture of relief and deep sorrow. "Gabriel," Augusto began, his voice choked with emotion, "I need to tell you something that will change everything." Gabriel immediately stopped what he was doing, stood up, and wiped his hands on his apron. He looked at Augusto, confused, but also curious. "What's happened, Mr. Valente?" he asked, unaware of the magnitude of the revelation he was about to hear. Augusto took a deep breath, trying to find the right words, but the emotion was overwhelming. "I received the DNA test results, and they confirmed something I already suspected." He paused, feeling the knot in his throat tighten. "Gabriel, you are Pedro, my son, the boy who disappeared so many years ago." The silence that followed the declaration was intense. Gabriel stood still, his eyes wide with surprise, not knowing how to react. He seemed to be trying to process the words he had just heard, but everything felt too surreal. "Sir, how can this be possible? I don't remember anything." Augusto took a step forward, tears now freely falling down his face. "I didn't want to believe it either, Gabriel, but you were found in the same region where Pedro disappeared, with the same pendant I gave him. And now the DNA test confirms it. You are my son, the son I lost." Gabriel looked at Augusto, incredulous, but also feeling something stir inside him, an emotion he had never experienced. Augusto's words sank deep, bringing a flood of fragmented memories, disconnected sensations from his childhood. He had never known where he came from, and now, standing before him, was a man claiming to be his father. Both stood in silence for a few moments, absorbing the magnitude of what had been said. Augusto finally took another step forward, extending his hand, hesitant but full of hope. Gabriel, still confused, but now with tears in his eyes, accepted the gesture. And in that instant, father and son embraced, as if the time between them disappeared. The barriers of pain, loss, and distance dissolved, and all that remained was the reunion of two hearts that had been separated for so long. Tears flowed from both, and the embrace grew tighter, stronger. Augusto held Gabriel as if he were afraid of losing him again, as if that moment were too fragile to last. Gabriel, on the other hand, felt a mix of relief and confusion, but also something he had never felt before: belonging. His whole life, he had carried the void of not knowing where he came from. But now, in Augusto's arms, he finally felt like he was home. "I searched for you for so many years," Augusto whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "I never gave up. Deep down, I always knew you were still alive. And now, finally, you're here." Gabriel, with tears streaming down his face, looked at Augusto. "I always felt like something was missing in my life, but I never imagined it was this. I never knew that I had a father searching for me." They stood together for a long time, sharing the weight of all the lost years, the words that were never spoken, and the moments they didn't live together. But in that instant, in the garden where Gabriel had worked in silence so many times, they truly found each other at last. Augusto knew he couldn't recover the lost time, but he also knew he now had a second chance. A chance to rebuild the relationship with the son he thought he had lost forever. Gabriel, for his part, felt that his life was beginning anew, with the truth finally revealed. And that day, in that embrace, they both began to heal the wounds of the past, with the hope of building a future together as father and son.